Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. President Trump wants to reduce the American presence in the Middle East and replace it with NATO. How would that work? Let's get to the bottom line. Last week, during his self-congratulatory speech after the assassination of Iranian General Qassem Solaimani, President Trump made a vague request.
Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities.
But what does that mean? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established by Western countries more than 70 years ago to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the USSR and after the 9/11 attacks, NATO became involved in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So what's next? Assuming responsibility for stability in the Middle East? Would NATO accept this new mandate? And what would it mean on the ground? Fortunately, we have three people in the room who have all the answers. Alexander Vershbow, I know him as Sandy, was a Deputy Secretary General of NATO until 2016, and before that, the U.S. Ambassador to the Alliance. He's now at the Atlantic Council. Heather Conley was a U.S. State Department official working on Europe and is currently Director of the Europe Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And finally, Niall Gardner is a foreign policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation and former aide to Lady Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. Welcome all. Thank you very much for being here. But before we start, lest you think Donald Trump made a statement about NATO in the Middle East on a whim, the next day he followed up with this exchange.
And I actually had a name. NATO, right? And then you have ME, Middle East. You'll call it NATO+ME. I said, what a beautiful name. NATO+ME. I'm good at names, right? USMCA, like the song, YMCA. Everybody, nobody could remember USMCA. I said, think of the song, YMCA. Now everybody says it. They don't remember the previous name of a bad deal, okay? Commonly known as NAFTA. No, if you add the two words Middle East at the end of it, because that's a big problem. That's a big source of problems. And NATO+ME, doesn't that work beautifully, John? Think of that. NATO plus me.
Heather, setting the village people and YMCA aside, is Donald Trump serious? He seems to be serious, seems to have given this some thought on NATO playing a much bigger role in the Middle East.
Well, certainly the Trump administration has been encouraging NATO very strongly to focus on counterterrorism, to focus on China. So this administration has tried to set new priorities for NATO, which in fact, when the leaders gathered in December in London, really embraced new domains like space, continue the counterterrorism operation, and then focus on China. So U.S. leadership in having NATO look at new directions, that is nothing new. But talking about a NATO-like structure in the Middle East, also a very old idea that's been around.
Is that what you think he's doing?
I'm not entirely sure. And I think this is where we have to have the conversation, because a NATO-like collective defense organization in the Middle East is something very different than looking at how NATO could be more proactive in the Middle East. But Steve, what's important to note is that the president's decision on assassinating General Soleimani suspended the NATO training mission in Iraq and forced many of our NATO allies to leave Iraq because the security situation became untenable and they're uncertain about the staying power and the durability of U.S. forces in Iraq. And without that guarantee, our allies cannot be in Iraq or Syria or elsewhere. So there's some huge challenges about saying we're out, let the allies in.
You're not highly confident that this is a well-baked plan yet?
I think it is an idea that's now in search of a strategy, a framework, and a policy.
Now, I heard you the other night and was very impressed that you saw more solvency in this than I think many others that have looked at this. Tell us what you think about NATO playing a greater role in the Middle East.
Well, I think that basically President Trump is making an appeal really for NATO allies and partners to play a bigger part, actually, in terms of burden sharing. In terms of Western operations in the Middle East, in fact. I don't think that we are going to see the expansion of NATO to the Middle East. I think that's a non-starter altogether. But at the end of the day, this goes back to President Trump's central message to the NATO alliance, which is that there needs to be a greater degree of burden sharing, that the US cannot overwhelmingly bear the entire burden on its own. We need to see NATO partners putting more boots on the ground, spending more money in terms of military operations. And I think what we saw at the NATO summit was very significant in London. The president really taking ownership of NATO. He started off as a NATO skeptic. He's now the biggest defender of the NATO alliance and taking on Emmanuel Macron's claims that NATO is in effect brain dead. And so I think this is really a pitch for NATO partners to step up to the plate, to do more. I don't think you are going to be seeing any expansion of the NATO alliance itself, though.
So do you think NATO is brain dead today?
No.
Let's roll I have a little clip from Emmanuel Macron defending that statement. Let's play the clip from President Macron.
I know that my statements created some reactions, and shake a little bit. A lot of people, I do stand by. And I have to say, when you look at what NATO is and should be, first of all, this is a burden we share. And President Trump just reminded you some figures, and the fact that this is perfectly true, that the US overinvested decades after decades, and it is #1 by far. And I do share the statement. That's why I'm a strong supporter of a stronger European component in NATO.
So now, just before you leave this subject, because I'm fascinated by this question, and I know that you're a supporter of Boris Johnson, and it's this interesting mix within NATO of what I would call pugnacious nationalism, kind of tied together with folks like Macron, maybe Merkel, that are principled internationalists. How does the equilibrium between those sorts of personalities get set?
Well, I think what is most interesting at the moment is that the US and the UK really are the two powers that are most committed to the NATO alliance, headed by Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Whereas Emmanuel Macron, I think, has been doing his best to undermine the NATO alliance. The so-called internationalists is being basically sticking a knife into the back of NATO. And of course, Macron's big idea is to have a European Union army, in effect, to compete with NATO. And I think it's a disastrous idea. It's no wonder that Vladimir Putin thinks an EU army is a great idea, because, of course, it will split the NATO alliance, weaken NATO. And I think this is the usual mischief coming from Monsieur Macron, which is not unusual, of course, from a French president. But I think that everything Macron is saying is designed actually to weaken NATO rather than strengthen it.
Sandy, is NATO at a crossroads now? Has Donald Trump simultaneously asked for its powers to be expanded at a moment where many of its leaders don't know why it exists?
Well, NATO's always at a crossroads. It's always in crisis, and it usually
that's the constant, right?
Usually finds its way forward. It adapts, and NATO's very good at adapting. But I think that this is a serious moment for a number of reasons. First of all, Macron's challenge is serious. I think part of it is designed to shift NATO's focus more to his #1 security concerns, which are the instability and the extremism in the Middle East and North Africa. In that sense, he may have some overlap with President Trump. But I think there's also a lot of new threats that are on the horizon that NATO is just beginning to play catch-up on, including the rising threat of China, not only in the East Asia context, but in Europe and in Europe's
so that'll
broader
be
neighborhood.
NATO Asia?
I'd like to leave the name intact.
Yeah.
It's got a fine pedigree, 70 years of success. But I think, coming back to what President Trump is saying, I think he is trying to make NATO more relevant in his own peculiar way. And I think he is not only preoccupied with the immediate aftermath of his strike against Soleimani, which has, I think, thrown U.S. strategy in the Middle East into some kind of tailspin, but I also think he's correct in saying that these are the kinds of threats that NATO has to be more capable of dealing with. He's been saying this for a long time, even before he was president, but especially in his first year, when he had his first meeting with NATO leaders. It was then that he first stressed the need for NATO to do more against terrorism in the Middle East, and NATO has actually been responding. My concern is NATO is...
What grade would you give NATO on its response?
I would
give when you were there? Yeah. And then
when I was there and since, I think NATO gets at best a C+. They talk the talk. They talk about this strategy of projecting stability to their wider neighborhood, which sounds really nice. But when you look at the actual programs and initiatives that go with that, it's pretty much a hollow shell. There's very few resources that are being put behind these programs. And I think the Southern allies themselves, who should be doing more in their own neighborhood, are very ambivalent about having NATO do more. And I think we're going to see that in the debate over the president's latest comments. Allies sort of talk the talk, but when it comes to the crunch, they don't think NATO is the ideal instrument for dealing with the Middle East.
And where does Turkey fit into this equation? There's been a lot of debate about Turkey and the Kurds. Emmanuel Macron's comments about NATO came after Turkey seemed to move in a different direction without coordination with other NATO members. And I am pretty sure that Turkey is not going to be thrilled with a greater NATO presence in some of these countries because of its closer relationship with Iran. Niall, where do you see Turkey in this? Do you look at Turkey as a sound NATO ally?
Unfortunately not, actually. I think that Turkey's role has been very destabilizing and very negative in recent years, and we saw that
That's a strong statement.
Amply displayed recently with its campaign in Syria.
Do you think Turkey should be expelled?
No, I mean, I don't think Turkey should be expelled. I think Turkey is too important a NATO ally for it to be expelled. And of course, Turkey has played a very important role in recent NATO operations, especially in Afghanistan. But I think the direction that Turkey is taking at this time is an extremely dangerous path. And Turkey has to decide whether it wants to remain anchored really to the Western alliance or whether it wants to take a different path. But I am very concerned by the direction that Turkey is taking. And Turkey really needs to make a very clear choice in the coming years. But I have to say, I think that Erdogan's popularity domestically is declining, which is a good thing. And I think a lot of Turks are very uneasy with the direction that the country is taking at this moment.
But Heather, I'd like to get your view on Turkey too. But part of the legacy, at least for the last 70 years of NATO, Turkey was there at the signing as well, is that administrations have come and gone. There have been different personalities in all of these jobs and leadership in all of these countries. But NATO has sort of stood still and has been resilient and has continued to function. But are we at a crossroads on Turkey?
Well, I think, again, Niall is right. Turkey is causing instability in the region, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey was brought into the alliance in 1952, so it wasn't a founding member, but it was done so in part because Turkey and Greece were under such heavy influence by the Soviet Union. So, as Niall said, this was a very geostrategic initiative to contain the influence of the Soviet Union. But Turkey has always been a problematic and challenging member of the alliance. But the alliance, to Sandy's point, has always found ways to bridge that gap. I think the bridge, though, is starting to get more brittle because of President Erdogan's decisions that he's making. And you're absolutely right. President Macron's frustration and explosion and the brain dead comment was really the frustration of Turkey militarily and unilaterally intervening in northern Syria for the third time. And of course, that does create an alliance challenge. Should an ally intervene, there's a problem. They call upon the alliance for support and collective defense. Then you bring the alliance into it. So big challenges. And of course, NATO has always had a challenge since 9/11 defining what they call a Southern strategy. That's that counterterrorism. NATO works best when it's training, it's doing security sector reform, infusing the values. Unfortunately, NATO allies cannot sustain forces in the Middle East without the United States and its critical enablers. When we remove those enablers, which we do sometimes without notice and without consultation, that ally cannot sustain their presence. So what do we want? If we want allies in the Middle East, then the U.S. has to build some credibility and sustainability and predictability in its force posture.
I agree with that, and I think it's important to remember that Macron's concern about NATO being brain dead was partly about Turkey's action, but was also about U.S. greenlighting of the Turkish intervention in northern Syria and raised questions about the reliability of U.S. leadership. And I think this latest initiative, unfortunately, may be raising some of the same questions, particularly as everybody knows, that it was a half-baked idea that just kind of came spontaneously.
I mean, are the Saudis applauding this comment? Are the Israelis applauding it? Or Jordan? I mean, I'm trying to think now, we don't have on the show, but leadership in the Arab world, when they heard this, is it something some of these countries said, yeah, we're all up for that?
I think they've been fairly quiet and just waiting to see what it actually means. I don't think it means a new organization, or certainly doesn't mean expansion of NATO membership, but it does mean seeing the Europeans step up to bear a bigger share of the burden, and that's a good idea. But as Heather said, the Europeans can't do this by themselves. If the president is talking about Europe literally taking over and the U.S. can exit the Middle East, then he's kidding himself. NATO doesn't function without a strong U.S.
But let me ask you,
backbone.
what is the point of what's the right balance there? Because when you look at U.S. contributions to NATO, staggeringly large. UK next. Got Britain, France, Italy is like way, way down. So I've been looking into the numbers, but there's another side of it which asks the question, is there a moral hazard problem that's been created by the U.S. essentially being there as a guarantor of last resort on all of these issues? And does it not make sense for the U.S. to step back and say, we're going to step back, and you ought to do more, and NATO, whatever form it is not that the U.S. would be absent, but the U.S. might not be leading as much. And certainly I think that would be consistent with President Obama as well.
Yeah, I think it's been a position of many administrations going back years from the inception of NATO, that the Europeans need to carry more of the weight. And I think this is an opportunity to rebalance. It's not going to be a sea change. I think the U.S. is the driver of the strategy in the region. The U.S. needs to stay engaged. But I think they can call upon the allies to put more troops into the training missions that are in Iraq and other parts of the region, putting more resources into some of the other NATO programs that are helping stabilize North Africa and places like Morocco, Tunisia, maybe put some more ships into the Eastern Med and into the Persian Gulf as part of a freedom of navigation strategy, so the U.S. doesn't have to do the heavy lifting there. This could all be done under a NATO flag. It could be done on an ad hoc coalition basis. But the bottom line is the Europeans should be doing more in these kinds of areas. I
am interested in what net add President Trump has brought to this debate about the Middle East and NATO and what was there before. Let's listen to a clip from a previous president.
We're bolstering our efforts on NATO's southern flank. The alliance will increase our support to EU naval operations in the Mediterranean to stop arms traffickers and go after criminals that are exploiting desperate migrants. And we're going to do more to help partners from North Africa to the Middle East to Georgia strengthen their own defense capacity.
Niall, President Obama was making some of these same comments before. So is what we're seeing from President Trump really continuity, not new?
Yeah, I think you do see a high degree of continuity. Every recent president has campaigned for greater levels of burden sharing, greater defense spending among NATO partners. So Trump's message isn't essentially different, actually, to that of Barack Obama's. I think the difference is that Trump has been a lot more forceful, actually, in enforcing the message, yes. And I think it has had a real impact. I mean, overall levels of defense spending among NATO allies significantly higher, actually. And Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has consistently and repeatedly made this point. U.S. leadership of the NATO alliance at this time is fundamentally important, but it's also working, and it's having a real impact. So I think overall Donald Trump has actually been very successful on the NATO front, but the message that he is conveying is very similar to the message that's been conveyed by the last few U.S. presidents. And U.S. leadership, I think, is absolutely vital. It has to continue, because if the U.S. stepped back on the world stage, I hate to think what would happen. I mean, European countries really do not have the strength and the resolve or the levels of military spending to lead across the world. And so American leadership is fundamentally important. And I think the Europeans themselves would be absolutely frightened to death if the U.S. actually stepped back on the world stage. So Macron can criticize Trump all he likes, but the reality is the French depend, like the rest of Europe, upon the U.S. security umbrella, and I'm sure he understands that.
Heather, how much hubris, I mean, I feel odd asking this question, do we have about approaching things like the Middle East and NATO's role? I interviewed former Senator George Mitchell a while back, and I asked him not just about the Israel-Palestine negotiations he was involved with, but the broader Middle East and America's role, Europe's role. And he basically said, look, there's a sectarian battle going on between the Sunni and the Shia. There's a Shia crescent. We talked about General Soleimani back then and Iran's transnational terror networks. And they said they need 400 years to work this out. Give us a call when it's over. Otherwise, stay out. And I am interested when you look at a lot of the proxy conflicts in the region, you look at Saudi, Iranian competition, Turkey competition in the region, whether or not NATO is just too full of itself to think that it can inject itself easily into these conflicts and even stabilize them, given their scale.
Well, I think, Steve, you're making so many important points, and it gets back to what Niall was saying. This is almost, in a way, about U.S. leadership. NATO's engagement in the Middle East is predicated on a durable, predictable U.S. leadership policy. And we know what happens when the United States removes itself. See Syria, see Libya, Russia fills that vacuum. Iran fills that vacuum. Instability continues to grow. NATO can do more. I think there would be the political willingness to do more because our European allies are directly impacted by instability in the Middle East and North Africa. But there has to be a framework. And it gets back to your earlier point about we seem to have two modes of leadership, the United States does, towards the rest of the world, particularly NATO. Either we're in charge of it and we're directing it, and allies need to do what we say, and we're this force mobilizer, or we say, we're not interested, you have this, we have other things to do. We have to find a third way, which means that the U.S. provides the predictability and the framework, but that other allies must step forward. But the kicker is that the U.S. may not be able to exactly dictate how that other ally will manage that operation, and we have to be okay with that. And we have never defined that third way, and we've created this cycle of dependency where the allies have made, and the UK is particularly, I think, they've made a strategic bet that the US will always be there and they will follow under their coalitions. Well, this is basically saying the US will not be there.
Right.
What are we going to do?
In our last couple of this fascinating conversation, I'd like to just ask each of you just give us a quick, very fast tutorial on if we gave you a lot of power to make NATO resilient and to survive in the future and to play a role in the Middle East, what are the things this president needs to think about to get it right rather than wrong? Sandy?
Yeah. Well, if I could get my wish, I would like to see the Europeans.
You get your wish.
Seeing the Europeans actually having more of the capabilities to carry out operations without as much dependence on the United States.
So that's a deal breaker. If they don't, it's
well,
squandered.
I mean, I think we have too many interests to literally cut them off.
Right.
But we should keep the pressure on for greater burden sharing, greater investment in the right capabilities. We have the French talking boldly about how they're the leaders in intervening in North Africa. But if the U.S. weren't providing intelligence, aerial refueling, the French operation would grind to a halt. So there's a lot of hubris on the French part. But I think coming up with a more balanced paradigm for NATO should be our goal for the next 10 years. And I think Trump, in his own strange way, may have started the debate that could actually get us moving in that direction.
Heather, what would be your recipe for the president to get it right?
For the president, Europe, a couple prescriptions. Europe must spend more on defense capabilities. They must enhance deployability and readiness, and they need the political will to execute. The U.S. needs to be a predictable, responsible partner in knowing what they can count on. And for the president, he has to understand that you cannot compartmentalize the security relationship. You cannot attack our allies with tariffs and sanctions, undercut Europe's leaders politically, but then expect them to follow your leadership when you need them.
Now I'm going to give the last word to you.
Well, as Heather says, we certainly need more investment by NATO allies, more capability on the part of NATO allies. But at the same time, we need to see NATO partners stepping forward, putting more troops on the ground in Iraq and Syria, for example. Also, I hope that we are seeing the beginning of the end of the JCPOA Iran nuclear agreement.
So just not to interrupt, but you would pour more into what Donald Trump has called endless wars.
Well, we need to see, I think, European allies waking up to the fact that the Iran nuclear deal is dead in the water. We need to see European partners applying sanctions against Iran and standing up to what is a tremendous threat, I think, to the free world in Tehran at this time.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Ambassador Alexander Sandy Vershbow, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Heather Conley, former U.S. diplomat for Europe, and Niall Gardner, head of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all. That was a terrific discussion. So what's the bottom line? NATO has been the security blanket for a lot of countries, with the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Turkey, and others just tossing that blanket wherever they want. Now it's clear that there is a dissension in NATO between key stakeholders on what the security blanket should cover. Will the Middle East be next? None of the experts that you just heard from agree with Donald Trump that a NATO+ME is in the cards. And now I can't get the Village People singing YMCA out of my head. Donald Trump can only push so far. The Middle East is not going to become a NATO obsession, and that's the bottom line.